Hey everyone, welcome back to What Does the Bible Say? Today we're diving into chapter 4 of Galatians, subheading on this one, Fears for the Church. So let's give it a look.
You are watching the Beyond Sunday podcast.
Okay, as I mentioned, we are diving into chapter 4. Last time we kind of wrapped up chapter 3. It was one of those subheadings that passes from one chapter into the next, kind of does a little handoff into it. So we're going to begin in verse 8 of chapter 4 in Galatians, and here's what Paul has to say for us today. But then, indeed, when you did not know God, you served those which by nature are not gods. But now, after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements, to which you desire again to be in bondage? Oof. You observe days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid for you, lest I have labored for you in vain. Brethren, I urge you to become like me, for I became like you. You have not injured me at all. You know that because of physical infirmity, I preached the gospel to you at the first. And my trial, which was in my flesh, you did not despise or reject, but you received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus. What then was the blessing you enjoyed? For I bear you witness that, if possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. Have I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? They zealously court you, but for no good. Yes, they want to exclude you, that you may be zealous for them. But it is good to be zealous in a good thing always, and not only when I am present with you, my little children, for whom I labor in birth again until Christ is formed in you. I would like to be present with you now and to change my tone, for I have doubts about you. All right, there we go. Those are the first words from Paul for today. Man, what happened here? He's got this really great start for us and then dives into a lot of worry and fear. Thus the reason I guess they named the subheading Fears for the Church. So what's he saying to us here? He says, in the past, you served all these structures. So if we were talking to Jewish believers, we may look at all the various feasts, all the various observances, all the various details. For the Gentiles, there were other, gods and forces of nature and things like that they served. And he acknowledges that, okay, this was true in the past. You guys have seen that. And in seeing that, those things were not effective. I love that he refers to them as weak and beggarly. And, these are ineffectual. They're really no good. But now you've known God. You've known his goodness. You've seen his promises. And with a choice between those two, you're turning back? And that's a really great question. When you really just start thinking about that, he said, okay, so you've had this life before God. And I think this is a fair question for all of us. You've had this life before God. You had an ineffectual life. You had no power in your life. God wasn't at work in your life. You probably were trying to make changes in your life and just really despondent about how everything was going. And now, here you've got God at your side, Christ alive in you. And with the opportunity to choose between holding on to that, this transforming, life-giving spirit within you, or going back to worshiping dead, weak, and beggarly things, which way are you going to choose? So it's putting that right up front in front of us. And I always love how Paul makes these arguments so we get to see and understand exactly the nature of the choice we're making. Sometimes it feels like, well, I'm just doing this, but Paul's going, no, really, here's the end game. This is what you're doing. You're choosing other things when you go this way. So he says, so you've known God, and I love this. We don't just know God, he knows us. And we see this from Matthew 7, verses 21 through 23, it's important that God knows us as well, that we are known by him, because in those verses over in Matthew, Jesus is talking about getting to the end of time. And, somebody could say, hey, I've done a lot of work in your name. I was on the Try Hard bus. I performed and I did all this stuff. And he says, but I never knew you. And that's a sobering statement to sit there and say, but there was all this effort I poured into it. I followed structures and all this stuff, but I don't know you. And that's not supposed to be us. As followers of Christ, we should be known by God. Not only do we know who he is, I hear that and everything else. We'll see in one of Paul's other letters that, over in James is the one that tells us, hey, so you believe in God. Great. Even the demons do that. So it's not just believing, but it's trusting in the efficacy of Christ's work, trusting that what he said was enough, and not trying to add our own things back onto it. So why go back to the weak stuff? Why step back into legalism or going back into worshiping other gods? And you think about this, hey, I know I'm praying to God, but there's this one great God of the earth, or this God of fertility that we're going to pray to so that we get a great crop or something this time. I'll just sprinkle a little bit of that on. But those things aren't more helpful. And, following this, if we think about the exact path that Paul is talking about here, he's talking about a type of legalism because, he's talking about the circumcision crowd is trying to bring everyone over into their group. And it's this covenant bond, they're saying, and you've got to, to really, really be a person of the covenant, you have to also do this physical act. But it's just a form of legalism. It's not going to add anything to it just because you've done some extra, quote, work. I love this quote by Warren Wiersbe, a great theologian, Bible commentator, and he says this: one of the tragedies of legalism is that it gives the appearance of spiritual maturity when in reality it leads the believer back into a second childhood of Christian experience. So I love this idea. Here we're talking about, well, I'm doing more things. I'm doing kind of inner circle things. Maybe that's a good way to look at it. I'm on the fringe out here, but fewer people have taken this step, so I'm going to take that step. Fewer people have taken this other step as well. I'm going to get further and further in the inner circle. But Wiersbe tells us you're not getting more and more mature and more enlightened. You're actually going back to more rudimentary things. And it's like a new childhood. And as we read in previous chapters, that was a place of slavery. We were under a tutor, under a guardian, and we're just stepping back into a position of slavery. No good. It's serious enough, this issue, that Paul is worried. It may be a small thing at present, but where will this first step carry us? It's starting with the discussion about circumcision. But when enough of us are in the circumcision club, what's the next thing we're going to add to it? That we're going to say, yeah. With this inner circle now, there's got to be an inner circle. And, in this room, not only are we going to follow the path of circumcision, we're actually going to go back to the sacrificial system as well, as an example. So, where does that going to carry you if we keep going in this way? It's not helpful, Paul's saying. There's a great bit in a commentary I was reading through, and it was talking about the truth of John Wesley and his experience. And it said that before his conversion, check this out, he was a pastor's kid. He served as a pastor. He was orthodox. He followed all the rules. He did good works. He was a missionary, and he studied the Bible, but he was chained by effort. John Wesley said himself, I had even then the faith of a servant, though not that of a son. So it's an interesting thing. John Wesley considers that later on in his life, he had this moment of sincere, true, deep conversion. He said, I was following all the rules. I was working as a missionary. I studied the Bible. I followed all the rules. And yet his point of conversion, he considers to be this later activity, this later moment where he had a deep, abiding faith in God, where he had been set free, where, as Paul is talking about, we've moved from that tutelage to where we are now sons and heirs. And that was what he considered his point of conversion. So why would we go backwards in this? So Paul's bringing all this stuff up in front of us. He wants to let us know that this isn't a going forward. Don't let them trick you with those arguments. It's a going backwards. As we look at what else Paul's talking about here, he mentions an infirmity in here. This is kind of interesting. So, because I love some of these context clues. Not only do we get how do we live as the church, but we get to see some of the story and the history of the gospel. And so Paul's mentioning there's an illness, an injury of some kind that he's got going on. And so apparently there was something wrong with him that caused him to go there and to preach. And we get this impression that he was weak and not very impressive. He's kind of giving us that upfront piece, but they received him in. So there was something about what he had to share that was worthy. And he even mentions, well, let's see, where is that? Down in verse 15, he says, you were even so blessed by me. You were so excited about the witness I gave that you would even have plucked out an eye for me. Meaning they were willing to do anything to help him. That's pretty serious. And this space right here, it just kind of gives you this sort of feeling, at least for me. Like I want to know the backstory. Tell me what was going on. Because through the book of Acts, while we get this glimpse of Paul's life, there's so much that he lives and experiences in his life. We don't get enough of it. This would be great to be able to hear this. But so he makes this little side jaunt over here. But as we continue on into verse 17, he starts talking about how the Judaizers are very zealous and they're excited, very earnest in trying to recruit people in. And he really gives us the understanding that just because someone is zealous, just because they're excited, because they're fervent, they're very earnest about this, they're passionate about what they're talking about, doesn't mean they're right. And that's important for us to know. People can have very convincing arguments. They can be very persuasive. People can speak with passionate, embellished pleas and tones. It doesn't make them right, though. It may make them convincing, but it doesn't make them right. Paul himself can tell you that, when he, before encountering Christ, that in those days before he actually encountered Christ, that he himself was zealous. He zealously persecuted the church. He zealously was trying to imprison and kill people. But he was just as wrong as these Judaizers are here. And as we're really looking at what the crux of the issue comes down to, Paul's explaining to the church here that there's surface compliance. There's a lot of energy that goes into it. We put in a lot of effort, but in that there's not real faith. Think back to the John Wesley thing where you were talking about a lot of works, not a lot of real faith, or in reality, trusting God. The Judaizers were drawing people away from a kind of resting faith, a trusting in faith, and drawing them away from their broader community into this group of what I'm sure they were trying to paint as like a group of super Christians, this inner circle. We are a special group of people because we've taken this extra effort. So this group of legalistic people is really divisive, trying to break that down. And Paul's trying to tell us that if you go, you aren't following God. You're following a group of people, because following God, you trust in what he's already told you. And if you're not doing that, well, then the reality is you're following these people. And what power or authority do the people have? None. It's not righteousness. You're following after a system that they are trying to place in front of you. Did it have its place? Yes, at one time. But we're no longer slaves to that. We are sons and daughters. We are heirs now. And so we have a freedom from that system. And that's following God, is following in the next steps he's asking us to take. Going backwards, you're just following after people. And so Paul finishes up and really tells us that as he's closing this subheading here, that Paul has serious concerns for his children, people that he's brought to the life of faith. He says, I feel like you guys are being swayed by this. It sounds clever. And, if you have a kid, especially like a teenager, they have so much influence going on in their life around them, and you get worried about them because they seem to be under the sway of all these influences. And you go, gosh, I'm so worried for you, because we try and speak truth. Other people have time and they're trying to speak, other kinds of influence into them and pull them away from the truth that you want them to follow. And Paul has this same feeling for this believing church. That's why he calls them my little children. And he says, I helped bring you to true life in the faith. And now I have doubts. And that's something we should take pretty seriously as we begin moving forward. He has doubts. And if any of us find ourselves in those positions where we're in the try-hard mode, or we're following after systems, Paul would look at us and tell us the very same thing. I have doubts. So I think that's going to wrap us up for today. Next week, moving deeper into chapter 4 and finishing it up. So join us back for that. We'll see you next time.
This has been another episode of the Beyond Sunday podcast. And don't forget, like, share, and subscribe.